Yeah, well, I mean, to go back into the mid 1980s, I guess, and at that time there was no real structure within Ngāti Toa. Obviously, we had our kai kōrero, and they were principally really the leaders, but there's no formal structure. And I guess it wasn't until later in 1980s when the government started, we went through that devolution of Department of Māori Affairs, etc. And the government looking for replacements, and so they developed the new ministry, well, two initially, and there was the Ministry of Māori Affairs, and then there was Te Tai, or the Iwi Transition Agency, and at that time I was working in IT. I was running a small software house in Wellington, and I was approached by Kara Puketapu if I wanted to take up a role as an iwi development manager, particularly for Ngāti Toa. It didn't take me too long to say yes, because at that time I was going through the Renaissance period of acquiring the language, etc., tikanga, getting to understand my history, my background, particularly as it focused on Ngāti Toa. So I was going through all of that, and I thought this was a great opportunity, so I took up the challenge. The tribe agreed that I should do it, and so I became the development manager. And from that role, I transitioned into becoming, well, I suppose, the chief executive for Ngāti Toa. And the role expanded as the years went by, and so it was my task, if you like, is to restructure the tribe so that it had a structure, that it was organised, and then to look at how we could develop, because at that time, he wi pohara ki Ngāti Toa, kua ngarongo mia hoki te nui o ngā whenua, e te noi ho kei te toe. So it was my task then to sort of look at what I can do in order to develop, and that included things like our health, our education, and then of course there was the treaty claim. So I drafted the first statement of claim, but that was soon handed over to the lawyers to do, and so I went through some early periods of that, which was, I'd never really been in a courtroom before, and then we had to go and meet with Ngaitau and all of the other iwi of the Waipounamu to work out, kei hea hoki te taukati ki wau hia tātou. And so I was thrust in the role of then having to learn our history, and it didn't take me long to realise is that, well, while the Ngāti Matua had an understanding of Ngāti Toa, they didn't have it in any real depth, and so I went on a journey of reading, of learning, of talking to people, and gaining more and more information about the tribe, which I had to, really, because we had to meet in the Wairau Appellate Court, and where, fortunately enough, we had a couple of law students here in Takapua here, and they pointed me in the direction of Richard Boast, who was at that time a senior lecturer in law at Victoria University. And Richard pointed me in the direction of his wife, who was a lawyer, and at that time working for Kensington Swan, and she was developing a Maori unit within Kensington Swan. So that was a fortunate coincidence to meet with Richard Boast and also with Deborah Inman's, his wife. And we had a great partnership in developing our response to the Treaty of Waitangi and our claim. And so initially that took me down to the South Island, to Christchurch. And, he wi pohara hoki a Ngāti Toa I taua waia, I ta mehora kau he muni, ka hapai ake hoki I a tātou ki ahu ai hoki ki ta wero. But anyway, we did it. We went down there, and it really opened my eyes because I met all at that time, the burgeoning leadership of the different tribes of Te Waipounoma, and I got to understand their story, and they got to understand our story, and so it was a great period to learn, you know, because we were all sort of learning at that time, and and of course, Ngai Tahu were able to, you know, they were in a much better position than any of us, any of the other tribes. And that they did have a fund. They used their education trust, which was founded around some West Coast properties, and used that to fund their things. So they had brought in Paul Tien, who was a QC, across the old, you know, a Rumpel-esque type figure, a character. And also at that time, Finlayson was developing his skills in the area as well. So it was a huge challenge. But Deborah did one good thing in that at that time, Joe Williams, who is now, you know, sits on the Supreme Court, was I suppose. His first job was working at Kensington Swan. And so we had him for about half a day, and he developed his whole sort of viewpoint of what does a hika mean. And it was a wonderful piece of paper that he put before the judges, but unfortunately, I suppose in the Maori Appellate Court, one would have thought that they would have better understanding, but I've got to say is that I was highly disappointed with the way in which they approached it. So we had three judges there at the time, Hoi Maru, Ken Hinkson, and Judge Spencer from the north. So that was really the introduction, and so here I was an IT person, thrusted to a role in the Maori Appellate Court to talk about Maori history and to talk about the challenges of all the other tribes around us. And it was interesting. It was really interesting, but, you know, I mean, it was really difficult too at the same time. So that was the initial foray.
When you were younger, growing up,
yeah.
You know, what did you know about Te Rau Paraha and Te Rangi Maiata?
Well, I knew actually absolutely nothing because I was brought up in Tārawa. So Ngāti Whakaue, Ohune Mutu, Te Koutu, those were my, that's where I was raised, you know, amongst my Ngāti Whakaue cousins and uncles and aunts. Yeah. So, I had, while we would come down to Taupuwahia here for holidays and all that, and I got to know my relations down here and cousins and all the rest, I wasn't exposed to Ngāti Toa. I was more exposed to Ngāti Whakaue, but even then I didn't really know too much about it. At any rate, even though I was brought up in the pā for a while, and then, you know, even where we lived was just all relations around us. So I think I was generally what happened to most people my age is that yes, we were Māori, and yes, we were thankful that we were Māori, but it didn't really mean that we were sat down and learnt anything about. We didn't, you know. It was only till I was in my early 20s that I started to learn anything about Ngāti Whakaue to any depth, and that was really through waiata. So I was fortunate enough that Te Rangi Tauira taught me some of the waiatas and the stories behind them for Ngāti Whakaue.
When did you start to learn about Ngāti Toa? When do you remember starting to learn about Ngāti Toa, and what did you think about your tūpuna?
Well, I knew that I was Ngāti Toa, right? And I knew my cousins, my aunts, and all the rest. But I mean, it was post school really. Times when I came down to live in Wellington, But it wasn't really until, I suppose, I was getting on a bit, maybe about when I was about 30, somewhere around there. I'd been living in Sydney, and I was, heavily involved in IT development and that over there. And then I decided to come back to New Zealand. Me and my wife, we just had our first child, so we didn't want him to be brought up in Australia. So we came back, and the obvious place to come for me, anyway, was Wellington. I didn't want to go to Auckland. There was not a lot of IT in Rotorua at the time. So I came to Wellington, and I really enjoyed living in Wellington. I'm always happy to be in Wellington when I ever came on holidays, and that was always seemed to me a great place to come. I really enjoyed it, and so we did. And we bought a place out at Tita Bay, and from that point, right, I started to get closer. Of course, my father was still involved in Ngāti Toa, even though he lived in Rotorua. If there was an event to be held for Ngāti Toa, he would turn up. He would always come down and turn up. A lot of that sort of mixed in too with his political sort of roles that he had at the time, because Dad was the Maori Vice President for the Labour Party. So, I mean, there was a lot of call on him to come to Wellington. And so he would come down, and there was always something here. So his involvement too in the development of the Wānanga Raukua, for example. Whatarangi relied heavily on him, on his knowledge and his skill in terms of development. So Dad was the first ahorangi of the Wānanga, and he attracted a great deal of other Māori scholars to come and assist in development of the Wānanga. So it was a really, really exciting time if you were a young fella looking to develop your sense of what as to be a Māori. So we had, people like Ruka Broughton come to tutor us. We had Māori Marston. We had, Te Korona. It was just amazing, the quality of the people of the kaumata who had come down to assist. And then we had, even within Ngāti Rauka, we had the Kiriama whānau. Oh, fantastic whānau, of great knowledge. And that, so we were extremely fortunate. I was extremely fortunate to be able to get involved, right, with, say, the development of the Wānanga and my own personal trip, learning about Ngāti Toa, learning about our customs, learning about our history, and all that. So, it was just great timing, yeah.
On what you've learned, since then, you used to come down here to Takapūwahia, and this was home, and you felt comfortable in Wellington. But did you know how far Ngāti Toa went down here? Tell us about the boundaries of Ngāti Toa.
Well, of course, what actually happened is I started to learn about Ngāti Toa and all that. Then I started to read about Ngāti Toa, and of course one of the go-to books for me at that time was a book by The Life and Times of Te Rauparaha by Patricia Burns. And I was, I was enthralled by what she had written. And of course that complemented, was complemented what I was seeing in the Maori Appellate Court and in other sort of things, And so you started to learn, yes. Nobody told me, it was really picking up, I knew that I had an obligation to learn more about Ngāti Toa because I'd picked up this role as the development manager, and there were challenges ahead. The Treaty of Waitangi, everybody was talking about the treaty must go to the Waitangi Tribunal to, And so it was a period where I had to learn fast and learn a lot.
In your learnings, how would you describe Te Rau Paraha?
Well, I think he's everything that people say he is, you know. When you read some of the things, you get to understand, you put it into a context, you can see that he was an extremely resourceful person. He was brave, he was courageous, he was a great thinker, he knew about strategy, he knew about structure, organizational structure, he knew, he had a great tactical ability. I mean, he was certainly unique, and I think he was. Let's say, you know, when Wairau, his father, went to Puta and asked for the hand of Pare Kohachu. Well, you know, Puta made the remark. He says, well. To when it says, ko wai ka hua, ko wai ka tohu, ka puta, he taniwha. So he predicted, he was a bit of a matakiti, a Karawa Puta, and he predicted that out of the union of Wairau and Pare Kohatu would come taniwha. And that taniwha was, of course, Te Rau Paraha. So it was like he was predestined to achieve greatness. Yes, well, obviously after the Te Whakagao Hinga Kaka, a great deal of pressure. Well, actually, there was always a lot of pressure between the tribes of Kawhia and the tribes of Waikato. Even though they were related, even though they were close, reasonably closely related. However, as leadership does, there becomes, you know, challenges between leaders, etc. And so there had always been this ongoing tit for tat, tit for tat, you would call it. Of course, the big one was Hingakaka and basically Ngāti Toa and its allies were beaten at the time, and it was a huge battle. It wasn't just Ngāti Toa, and it wasn't just the Kawhia tribes against it. People called in their, you know, whanaunga from other tribes. So Tarawa was involved, Ngāpuhi was involved, Tūwhare Toa was involved, you know, because the hill was related, of course, to Te Rau Paraha, and that was also a descendant of Toa Rangatira. But, you know, all of these things, it's recognised as probably the largest ever battle, pre-European battle of Māori. So that was a little, and that was really the irrational sort of thinking of Piko Tarangi, really, why Ngāti Toa had lost that battle. But it happened, and but even after that, the tit for tat continued to happen. How can I put it? At any rate, just to shorten the story a little bit, Te Rau Paraha became friendly with some northern chiefs. Patuone, Tūwhare, Nene, Tā Matiu Rei Nene, became friendly with them. And one of the events that there was a taua. Karabatia hoki a taua e Ngāpuhi. Ko tana hea kia peka mai hoki kia Kawhia. Me ka haere ki Taranaki, ki te whawhai. So Te Rau Paraha became involved in that. So I think it was called Dam Your Whenua. But there are a couple of those things that were called Dam Your Whenua. So there was one raised by Te Whero. It was also called Dam Your Whenua, but there was one also developed, raised by Patuone, those Ngāpuhi chiefs, was also referred to as Tā Matiu Whenua. But anyway, on the Tā Matiu Whenua, which included Taropara as one of the leaders of it, so they went down to Taranaki and they did all sorts of things down there, then got as far as Tupokoteka and over to Wairau. But one of the things that occurred on that trip was when they were at Point Oho, it's in the southwestern corner of the Wellington here, right on the Cook Strait. Tūwhare pointed out to this kaipuke e rere mai ana I te moana o Raukawa, and he pointed that there was a sailing ship there, and he turned to Taropara and said, e koro, tēnei te wāhi mau no hoia, and that he should come here and live in this area. He says because Ngāpuhi at that time had determined that Te Whanganui-a-Tara was going to be a good port for Pākehā ships and that to come into. And they had already developed their relationship up in Te Whairangi, up in the Bay of Islands, and their relationship with the Pākehā sailors, etc., up there. So they had actually, Ngāpuhi, I think, had already determined that Te Whanganui-a-Tara was going to be one of the places that they would probably want to come down and settle. So they had planned, and curiously enough, they also warned Taropara that he should come down here, right, and not stay in Kāwhia, because they were planning to attack Tainui. That included Kāwhia as well as Waikato. So, as Uncle Joe Rene said, e ka loho tōni whakaaro I te hinenga roa Taropara. And so it rested in the mind of Taropara that this might be a place for him to come to get away from all the rarurare. So anyway, so it seemed to me is that Taropara also had a plan. He went on this expedition led by Patuone to find out what was actually down here. So some things happened which seemed to indicate that he was quite serious in moving down to the southern part of the North Island, and one of them was when they got to Wanganui. Of course, there was Ngāti Apa, and so what happened was the combined force were managed to overtake the tangata whenua of the area, including Ngāti Apa. And so Taropara arranged the marriage of Te Pikinga, who was the sister of the leading chief of Ngāti Apa at that time, to marry Tarangi Haiata. So to cement that in a marriage, and that would give Tarangi Haiata an interest in the area. So he did that. There was also some kōrero that in the Maryland court that then when he got to Te Whanganui-a-Tara, he left the rako here to live and to mind the coast. So these sorts of things, obviously, he could see that back in Kāwhia, that the ongoing rancor between the Kāwhia tribes, not just Ngāti Tō, there's Ngāti Kwata, Ngāti Rārua, and the Waikato tribes was going to continue, right? And so, yes, my view would be was that they weren't forced out. There wasn't a physical force that made them leave. It was a force that says, look, this has got to stop somewhere along the line, and the best way for it to stop is for us. And of course, in their trip down there, down to Te Whanganui-a-Tara, with the Tainui, with the Ngāpuhi iwi, because they at the time, Maupoko were the tangata whenua here, and they forced Moepoko out. And obviously here, when they got to Pukurua Bay, they could see the strategic importance of that particular part of Tupoko Teka, because it had clear views out to Whanganui, to the north, and over to the South Island and down to the south coast. So, so it was starting to form. And Te Raupara said, yeah, this would be not a bad place. And then there was Kapiti Island across, 4 or 5 miles out. And it would be a good place as well. So I'm sure after they had come down here, after they had beaten up the local iwi, I'm sure there was in his mind that this could be a very, very good place for the for Ngāti Toa, for Ngāti Rārua, for Ngāti Kota, for Ngāti Akumbaira, kia eke mai ai ki te tonga. And of course they did do it, right? So yes, there was pressure from Waikato, but I think the overriding thought in Te Raupa's mind, well, to him, and I think it's borne out over since that time, was that ko te upoko o teka, ko te tonga e wāhi pai ake kia kawhia.
Do you think it meant survival for Ngāti Toa, the hikinga?
Well, I mean, Ngāti Toa would still have survived if they existed, if they remained in kawhia, because I mean, Te Whetowhero made the comment that he wasn't there to exterminate them, he was there to maybe chastise them severely, but he wasn't going to, there was no way he was going to exterminate, because, I mean, Ngāti Toa Rangatira was a mokopuna of Tūpahu. Tūpahu was a significant chief and a founder of a number of tainui iwi. So, there was that sort of idea that Waikato was going to exterminate Ngāti Toa was never going to happen. Right? Never going to happen. Right?
But the heke speaks to his vision and his strategy.
Sorry?
The heke, the decision to leave speaks to his vision and his strategy for his people.
Yes, well, I think he's found a place that okay, there were going to be challenges as well, but he thought it was, this could be, the place for Ngāti Toa. And so it has. It's proved it. It's proved it was a great place for Ngāti Kota, a great place for Ngāti Rārua. Unfortunately, Tahu Mairangi, they returned back to kawhia, and nothing happened to them. They're still there. There's still Ngāti Toa people still in kawhia. So yeah, I think that's all a little bit sort of overdone, that sort of argument. And I think even today, after all the treaty settlements, right? Ngāti Kota had their treaty settlement, Ngāti Rārua had their treaty settlement, Ngāti Toa had their treaty, and the tribes are thriving. If they're back in Tainui, they'd have to be under the Tainui settlement.
So once Ngāti Toa arrived in Pōneke, what would life have been like? What was the boundaries?
Well, of course, the Moepoko were part of the Kurahopo. It was a Kurahopo iwi, and of course, Kurahopo extended from Wanganui, right, over to the South Island, and so they weren't going to give away just, oh, here comes Te Raupara, yes, let's. No, that wasn't going to happen. So what happened, of course, was that they organised a large taua to attack Ngāti Toa. But of course, what had happened prior to that, Te Pehi Kupe, who was a hereditary chief of Ngāti Toa, or the principal chief of Ngāti Toa, had attacked Kapiti Island and expelled Maupoko. So he took over the island, and of course Ngāti Toa then took over the island, and so they saw it as a bit of a refuge, a place that could be better defended than if they remained at Waikanai or at Pukirua Bay. So anyway, that's what happened. The tribes united, the Kurahopo tribes united and attacked Ngāti Toa at Waiorua, and that's named as the Pakanga of Waiorua, or the Battle of Waiorua, and or the Pakanga of Whakapaitai, but from Ngāti Toa we refer to the Pakanga of Waiorua, and it was there that the esteem of Te Rauparaha was printed, or the mana was enhanced, and that he defeated against the odds the combined effort of the Kurahopo tribes and secured Ngāti Toa's place, Ngāti Rārua's place, Ngāti Koata's place, and Atiawa's place in the region. And that was the battle which established our right and role under Māori tikanga to the whenua from here, and then eventually they followed on over to the South Island, and because the tribes of the South Island that had come to fort, then Ngāti Toa and its allies went over there and established the places over there for us.
Do you think his experience up in the far north with Patuoni, seeing how Ngāpuhi was getting along with the whalers and the sailors and the rest of it, was it probably what encouraged him to marry Ngāti Toa people into significant owners of ships and things like that?
Yeah, well, Te Raupara's tuakana was a chief by the name of Nohorua. And Nohorua's daughter, Teiwatō Rikiriki, she married a sailor by the name of Joseph Toms. And so there was that relationship in Atiawa. One of the whalers, a guy by the name of Barrett, married into that tribe. So yes, there were relationships between whalers, etc., and Māori, and certainly within Ngāti Toa it happened. And so you had that. I know. Well, I'm a descendant of that marriage between Joseph Toms and Teiwatō Rikiriki, and my great-grandfather, for example, learnt from his father, Joseph Toms, on shipbuilding and how to and also how to sail a large ship, and so what happened is that trade was developed, and Ngāti Toa would trade over to Melbourne or to Sydney, and Nohorua was known as Tom Street in Australia. So that's my understanding of things, anyway. And of course, my great grandfather as well. He married into a well-known maritime family in down these parts, into the Guards. So he married a guard and had a number of children to them, and then he somehow or another that marriage, he moved on from that marriage and went up north and married a Ngāpuhi woman. And so I'm also a descendant of that sort of thing, but closely related to the Guards as well, you see. So it's a funny old world, but that's That's how things happened. Which is another story in itself, because when old Jackie Gard, in his ship, the Harriet, founded it off the coast of Taranaki, on my Taranaki side, my kuia from there, ko Kauhoi, had a child to Jackie Gard. I come from that relationship as well. You have a look at my great-grandfather, old Ngāhui today, he's white as the driven snow. I'll probably get a hiding for that.
I guess the point is that Ngāti Toa was fully immersed in trade and business and knew what they were up to.
Well, of course, the Maoris became the breadbasket for the settlers when they first came here. I mean, they didn't know the country, they didn't know what to grow, etc. They thought, oh, you know, and so developed trade. You know, whatever it was, yeah, we could grow it, and we could, you know. So, and of course, it was always like a lot of other parts of the country. Every village wanted to have their pākehā. But we didn't know that we'd have to have a hell of a lot of villages to house all the pākehās who wanted to come here.
Yeah.
So it was a bit of a shock, I think, in the end, yeah.
Yeah, so that's a good segue into the New Zealand company and the relationship between Ngāti Toa and what do you think was happening back in those times?
Who, the New Zealand company?
When they started to come into Nelson and... Yeah.
Well, I mean, first of all, you know, the Wakefields were a bunch of fraudsters. I mean, and I think the issue then becomes, yes, they'd sold land which they didn't own in London or in England, and then all these people came out and looking for their land, and they didn't have the land, right? So, of course, it became a problem for Fitzroy and who was Governor General at the time, or the Governor of New Zealand at the time. So it was a real problem. And it was a problem for Māori, right? But the answer wasn't, well, sorry, send them back. There is no land that they own. The problem was then, how do we get the land? But of course, colonisation is all about that. It's all about taking resources from the indigenous people and handing them over to things. I mean, how would people like it today? For example, if China decided, okay, we're going to take over New Zealand and we'll send all our people over there and take over the land. Nobody would like it, right? How do you think Maoris would feel if these people turned up and says, oh, I bought this land in London? And they said, what are you talking about? And so that was, you know, I mean, so what the government did, they set out their plan because they had printed, after the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi, people couldn't purchase land. But then they tried to resolve those issues where people said, well, we'd already bought this land, so they set some rules about how that land should, those purchases should be approached. And so they established a land commission and appointed Spain to do that job. But it always, I mean, the thing is, if it hadn't been sold, it hadn't been sold. Why do we need a land commission to do this? Why were the Wakefields in the right? You know, so that they could do this. And of course, the issue was that what the governor did at that time, they says, well, to the so-called purchasers is that just tell us how much you spent, what you gave the Maoris for this land, and we will tell you how much land you can have. Where were the Maoris involved in that sort of negotiations? I mean, that was the fundamental of how it. And then, of course, what happened was, of course, the settlers and the Wakefields' only interest in the flatland, the arable land, the land that was available for them to immediately. They weren't interested in the hills and the mountains and all this. But all of a sudden, the hills and the mountains went too. and all of that sort of activity. So people wonder why Tarangi Haiata was upset. Because he didn't want a bar of it.
And up until that point, Ngāti Toa, like through Te Rauparaha and Te Rangi Haiata, they were playing along with Spain. They were waiting for the decision. Do you think that they, because they'd signed the treaty, so do you think that they had faith in the review?
Well, I think from the Ngāti perspective, right, at that time, there were two people who needed to give their consent. One was Te Rauparaha and the other was Te Rangi Haiata. Now, Te Rangi Haiata was always referred to as the nephew of Te Rauparaha, which he was. But then you've got to look at his father. Everybody just refers to Waitohi, his mother, who was a sister, older sister of Te Rauparaha. But when you look at his father was Te Rakaherea, and Te Rakaherea was also a child of Te Maunu. And so in actual fact, from that point of view, if you look at the father's side, Te Rangi Haiata was tuakana to Te Rauparaha. So he wasn't just the nephew. Let me just put it there. He was more than just the nephew, and of course he also was pretty hard-nosed. He was quite different to his uncle. He was tall and handsome and strong and powerful and clever and all the rest of it, right? But he was also a master, he was also a carver, he was also a poet, he was all these other sorts of things as well, right? And it was him principally who refused to enter into sales, right? Whether it was in Wairau, whether it was in Pōneke, whether it was in the Hutt Valley, whether it was in Poriro, whether it was in the Rangitike. It was always, he was not up to it. In actual fact, what happened was Te Rangi Haiata got Te Kaiaia, also known as Taringa Kuri, to carve a half-a-mile strip from the eastern hills of the Hutt Valley over to the west coast. So that's not an easy task to do, you know, when you look at the topography of the area. So a half-a-mile strip. So there was one drawn across. So it basically, if you look at where the Hutt railway, Lower Hutt railway station is, there used to be a lake there, Lake Rotokakahi. And so it was called the Rotokakahi line. So it went from the eastern hills, went through the lake Rotokakahi and over to the west coast to a place called Te Aratoura. A name, you know, Hekamaindei I a kawhia, you know, called Te Aratoura. So there's a place over there called Te Aratoura. And Pākehā were not, or immigrants were not, to go any further north than that. So, so it was Te Rangi Haiata. So he didn't approve of the sales. He didn't approve in the sales in the Hutt Valley. So that kicked off that sort of stuff in the Hutt Valley. But I mean, it was his right to decline the sale, right? But of course, what Governor Grey did, he got Martini Te Whiwhi and Tamihana to sign off as if they were Te Rauparaha. And because the Tamihana, of course, was Te Rauparaha's son, and Martini Te Whiwhi was the son of Waitohi, eh? Yeah. No, not Waitohi. It was anyway. Topiora, is it? Yeah. Sorry, I'll have to.
No,
here.
So it was.
Yeah, so they got those two to sign in place of and which was a fraud deal. It was done at the PAR, where Parliament now stands. At any rate, so it was a mockery, really, and of course they talk about Tarangi being a rebel. He wasn't a rebel. The governor was out of, was acting illegally, unlawfully. So, yeah.
So really early on, those tactics of conquer and divide were used against your people.
Yeah.
Very early on, the tactics of conquer and divide were used against Ngāti Toa.
Well, I'm not earlier on, but it certainly led to that, and I think so. I mean, Maori chiefs weren't slow to act. They could see where things were going. They could see that they'd heard about what had happened up north. Obviously, they must have heard what had gone up north with Kawiti and Grey sending up all those troops up there. And then once that had died down out there, he brought them all down to Wellington. They were all in Wellington, so he stationed them here in Wellington. Well, all those troops of the Confederation, of the Tainui and Aotearoa, they knew all about what was happening up there, and so yes, that led to differences. The chiefs were starting to think, well, I want my share. And so they began all that sort of bickering and all that around that. But it was Tarangi Haata stood firm. He says no, he didn't want this our land to go. And of course he was right. Who can say he was wrong? Well, from a Maori perspective, he was absolutely right. And yet he was branded a rebel. Yet from a Maori perspective, I would say he should be a Maori hero.
Tell me about...
And he should be a hero for the country, actually, because if that sort of thing happened here in this country again, who would you look for? You'd look for somebody like Te Rangi Haata.
Tell me about his relationship with Te Rongo.
With?
Te Rongo. Te Rangi Haata?
With
Te Rongo, his wife.
Well, there's not a lot written about it. Right? I mean, I don't know much. Look, I can't tell you at all about it. But plurality in marriages was not unusual. In fact, was probably the norm. So yeah, I can't tell you much about that relationship except that it ended abruptly where Te Rongo was shot by a Pākehā at Wairau.
What do you think the consequence of Wairau was for Ngāti Toa?
Well, it was the loss of land. I mean, it was, unfortunately for for Māori, George Grey, who was governor at the time, put quite a bit of effort into learning some of the customs of New Zealand. One of the customs that happened was that Māori customs was that if you were in a fight, in a battle, and you fell on the battlefield, then the whānau of the fallen chief could claim an interest in that land. So that's what Grey used as a mechanism to try and prize the Wairau out of Ngāti Toa's land. He articulated to the Ngāti Toa chiefs that, look, he says, my people have died, and I'm claiming this land. You know, I mean, it was, let's face it, you know, an English, you know, politician or whatever, you know, claiming land on a Maori custom. They weren't his people. He wouldn't have known who the hell they were, you know. Well, he might have known Arthur Wakefield, but you know, so what, you know. You know, so that's how he managed to squeeze the land out. And when that land sale was approved, all right, and it should never have been approved because Te Rangihaeta never ever agreed that it should be sold, right? The chiefs at the time decided that there was going to be a strip of land that would go from Cloudy Bay all the way up into the hills. And that never eventuated. Some land was given to chiefs, remained, but it's very small little bit of land. And then because it was then used for all of these settlers who were coming in, these migrants who were coming into the country, there was nothing left to give, you know, as a result of that. So for Ngāti Toa, and Ngāti Toa were given land up in Taihape. What does he use the land in Taihape if you're down here? You know, that was somebody else's area. So, you know, great injustice was done to Ngāti Toa. Huge injustice.
What about the injustice to your rangatira? So what happened to Te Rangihaeta and Te Rauparaha after Wairau?
Well, I mean, yeah, well, nothing really, nothing. Fitzroy, who was the governor at the time, he could not bring himself to charge Te Rauparaha or Te Rangihaeta with the killing of those settlers, because what they did was protecting their land, and he understood that they were there to protect their land. They didn't cause the issue. The issue was clearly caused by the constable who was in charge, or the police commissioner who was in charge at the time. Was clearly his fault. He was the wrong person to try and lead it, probably edged on by Captain Arthur Wakefield. And there was no regret, I don't think, that, you know, they caused their own misfortune. They should not. There was no reason for them to attack Ngāti Toa, because Ngāti Toa had not sold that land, you know.
But they still, so tell me about Te Rauparaha afterwards, because there was a warrant for his arrest, was there?
Well, I wasn't aware there was a warrant for his arrest. Oh, you mean the one up here? Okay, well, yeah, well, that all gets back to land as well, about the thirst for land out in the Hutt Valley. So basically, there was a difference between Te Rauparaha and Te Rangihaeta. But to be fair, Te Rauparaha left it up to Te Rangihaeta to decide whether there would be a sale or not, and Te Rangihaeta said no. What he did do, though, was to get that half-a-mile wide strip of land and as the boundary between where Pākehā could live. So he allowed them to go up to that point, but no further. Right? And so, so he didn't say, no, you can't come, but that was going to be the boundary. But of course, if they breached that, and the New Zealand company put people on the land that wasn't theirs to be had. And so that's why Te Rangihaeta took action to restore what he thought was the proper thing to do. And so he sent out a message to Ngāti Rangatahi to come down and to occupy the Hutt Valley. And he gave them rights to use the land and rights to, you know, to the forests there, the trees there, the fish there, etc. As a way to combat the settlers coming in. And of course, that created also an issue for Ngāti Rangatahi to defend the land with Te Rangi Haiata. And then on the other, on Purirua, Te Raupara did not agree that there should be a road driven from Wellington to Purirua and up into the hinterland, up into the Rangitike. Did not agree on that as well. So these sorts of things were stopping the acquisition of lands in the north, right? Would not allow it. And that's why there was a warrant for Te Raupara's arrest, and certainly the name branding of Te Rangi Haiata as a rebel. Was not a rebel, right? He was defending his land. So, you know, I mean, I mean, we even have people in the tribe here who are related from some of those settlers in the Hutt Valley. I think the fellow Stainton, who Te Rangi Haiata threatened to kill if he didn't leave you know, the Bulkot area, and fortunately for Stainton, he was a huge stutterer, and Te Rangi Haiata never, and I suppose Māori never ever had anybody who stuttered. And he burst into laughing, fell down on the floor laughing, and that saved Stainton's life. Anyway, but that's what it was all about. It was how land could be transitioned from Māori over into these immigrants, you know, and so, you know, yeah.
So, I mean, how do you view their behaviour, their protection of land? You know, they're called rebels, but how do you view them, those two ancestors of yours?
How do they what?
How do you view them?
Well, obviously, well. I think I mentioned earlier that after the fight with Ngāpuhi, up at you know, the Rua Peka Peka, yeah, up in Rua Peka Peka, the defence of the land by Kawiti. After that had died down, then Grey sent for the troops to come to Wellington, and so the troops landed here, and so he set up, okay, we're going to do something about this land. We're going to open it up, and so that's what happened. And of course, Te Rangi Haiata refused, so he was branded a rebel, and then he issued a warrant for the rest of Te Raupara. And so he used HMS Driver, which was a steamboat with mounted cannons, to kidnap Te Raupara, and also to bomb the Pāwata Nui that Te Rangi Haiata had built. And the interesting thing about that, of course, is that the message had come down from Kawiti, I suppose, somehow or another, where Kawiti learned that, okay, if they're going to bomb you with cannons, then we'll build trenches to protect us from the cannons. And well, I mean, I can only surmise that technique was learned from Kawiti, and Te Rangi Haiata did exactly the same thing. He built trenches to protect themselves, him and his people, from the attack by Grey on his path. So yeah.
What became of Te Rauparaha? He was arrested? Was he arrested? What happened to him?
Yeah, well, I mean, Grey had a warrant which was illegal, really. Yeah, I mean, but which was said to be illegal. And so his boat turned up one day, parked outside of Taupo Pa in Plimerton, and charged up with his Marines and arrested Te Rauparaha. There was no trial happened. He was then put on the ship Calliope, spent 6 months sailing around the coast of New Zealand, eventually ended up at Auckland Domain, where he was held in detention in a house known as the Chinese Garden, or something like that. But at any rate, you know, when the Calliope was moored at Pewhairangi or the Bay of Islands, Maunu, the chief there, heard the plaintive song, and he asked who the person was who was singing the song, and he was told it was Te Rauparaha. So he then went into negotiations with Grey. He wanted Te Rauparaha to be released, so he was offered up some land. Of course, Grey agreed. So he took the land, but he never released Te Rauparaha. So that's the sort of the person Grey was, you know. I mean, Grey had a reputation, of course, by having a number of young maidens, Maori maidens, in his household for I don't know what. But you know, you can think about that one too. But I don't think. I mean, he was there to colonise New Zealand, and that was taking the land by any means, you know, lawful or unlawfully, and stripping Māori of their wealth, sucking the wealth out of the country.
How important is it for you that, you know, these stories are told about these tupuna?
Well, it was important for us when we went to the Waitangi Tribunal. So we had to capture all of this corridor, right? And I think it's a great legacy that's been left behind, because it wasn't only, it's not only us Ngāti Toa saying this, right? So the other tribes around here were saying the same things, similar stories. And of course the Crown acknowledged, yes, that this was wrong. Te Rauparaha should never have been. There was no legal basis for his arrest, right? It was his land, he didn't have to sell it, right? Similarly, Whangi Hāta, right? But it's too late. All that land is now gone, you know, based on illegal actions, you know? And so we got a pitiful sort of settlement in reality, right, from what we should have had. But, you know, we had to move on, the tribe had to move on. So that the corridor's all there, right? And it's up to people, it's up to Ngāti Toa, if they want to understand it, then they can have access to that information. So fortunately, one of the things I did do, though, was to bequeath to Te Wānanga Ōrākua copies of all of the interactions that Ngāti Toa has had in terms of our treaty claims and all that. So it's there, and I'm sure people will want to understand, yeah, learn from it, yeah.
What do you hope for the next generations of Ngāti Toa rangatahi?
Would I take what?
What do you hope for the next generations?
Well, they're in a much better position than my generation was in terms of understanding more about Ngāti Toa. I think the legacy of of our settlement has given them opportunities that would never have come through any other means. It's not what we should have had, right? That's for sure. But it was a good basis for the tribe to develop further. And you know, I think. Well, you know, I've always been grateful for the fact that the tribe asked me well, not the tribe, a few Kaumātua asked me that maybe I should be looking at trying to help and do my bit for it. And of course, you know, growing up, particularly in a place like Rotorua, right, there's a lot of legal actions in terms of Māori land up there. The Maori Land Court, you know, it's extremely active in places in Tarawa, you know, because Tarawa were able to retain a lot of their land, not all of their land, but certainly a lot of land. And but here, Tupoko Teka, me te tauihu, te waka Māui, the negligible bits of land were retained. And that's really through the action of the New Zealand government at the time, and principally what George Grey had done and his actions, you know, his lies, his deceit, and ended up with Ngāti Toa, Ngāti Rāt, with Ngāti Kuata being pohara. You know, coupled with the way in which the law acted, with the Mackay brothers, pohara. You know, and you can clearly say that illegal actions, you know, after illegal actions, and then wrong decisions made in the court, you know, then you had people like, I mean, Ngāti Toa wanted Whitirea back. They had gifted it to the Church of England to build a school for the local Māori people. No school was ever built for Māori people. We asked for the land back, and of course, Prendergast, who was the chief judge of New Zealand at the time, declared the treaty a nullity. So that's the significance. These are the sorts of things that Ngāti Toa have had to put up with, right? Over the years, lies, deceit, and end up with nothing.
When you live in the centre of Wellington, and the Wakefield name is everywhere. There's streets and statues. Does that annoy you? What do you want to happen with that?
Well, I mean, I think it's extraordinary that you have a band of rascals, you know, ended up being honoured in such a way. I mean, I look out from my place where I live, and there, and staring in front of me is this monument to the Wakefield. You sort of think, jeepers, one of these days. That's ridiculous, you know. I just think, wow.
Do you think they should be removed?
Pardon?
Should they be removed?
Well, I'm not. Look, I think the things their involvement should be known, and that is, you know, the lies and deceits should be known about them, and as long as it's there, right, it'll always be a sore point for Ngāti Toa, right? And I think, you know, it is a focus. It's part of the history of the place. I don't think they should be honoured by any means at all, right? But it is a symbol, I think, of the crookedness of the wrongdoings of the Pākehā to Māori. That's what I think.